as quick as possible. The synchronization between 24 frame per second old style film and 30 frame a second television. The fact that film had motion blur unless you filmed it under really bright conditions, so you could set not the frame rate but the shutter speed shorter, so it would freeze and make hyper-realistic all motion on recording. Or animations or computer-generated movies that were too realistic. The first movies that were produced and put into theaters in some cases were animations, which means you have total control over how clean the image looks. The motion blur effect happens when it's low brightness and you are using film, but it can also happen with video too. Then there's interlacing, which causes double image effects. The expected look for an audience watching television, which is the primary way we see things outside of our direct experience, not film, was influenced by these frame rate changes, differences, compromises, noise, the compromise of using low bandwidth interlaced video rather than high bandwidth 60 frame a second filming. 24 frames a second is one of the lower speeds you can do where most people, not all, will not detect that they're watching a movie. That's not true. They detect it, but subconsciously only. It acts as a subconscious cue that you're watching something that isn't really a stage performance. One of the tricks you could do is film a stage performance on the same stage you would have a movie theater on. Have the actors walking back and forth, and then project the film and have people realize as they're watching the performance when you pull back the curtains, everybody's flat. And halfway through the performance, they start realizing this is a film projected from behind, or from the front in some cases. Enter ultra-realistic looking video. Some people perceive this, I didn't know what it's called, but it is very notable in soap operas. At some point, cable companies started putting out the ability to effectively give you 60 frame a second or 30 frame a second no motion blur images by pre-processing the images. Or more accurately, they filmed not on film, they recorded directly to video. Cheap productions in soap operas. Now, this cheap production, I noticed, also looked better than movies and film. It didn't have the fluttering effect if there was motion right to left or up and down. It didn't get any jittering going on. It looked really clean. What also looked that way? Any live broadcast, any only video only stuff. All fictional stuff, like movies that would be played back every year, like It's a Wonderful Life, would have that non-realistic, warm feel to them. But the harshness of newsflash, airplanes have rammed into the Twin Towers, had the same cues to it as a low-cost direct-to-video production like a soap opera. Most things were shot on film, yes, but you can shoot a film at 30 frames a second if you want to, but a lot of things were done direct-to-video. After a while, it became indistinguishable. Film started getting cheaper and then got more expensive, and then people just switched to video. And if you were watching it on cable, it was cleaner. It didn't have any of the visual cues saying this is fake. So you get people who are strangely compelled to watch, and they didn't know why, soap operas and the news. Probably a very bad combination to grow up with. This motion blur is extremely amplified and is a natural effect of early liquid crystal displays, LCD screens. You can't get away from it because the LCD screen takes time to spool up the current level and voltage level to turn on and off a pixel. Because it did. Also, early LCDs would create lines where you didn't want them because they did. TV sets and computers that were based on it were crap, in my opinion. I owned a couple. One of the ways to fix this motion blur problem that would be induced would be to fire the pixels pre-processed, which means the video would come in and internally there's a little computer reprocessing it to create really short frames, and you could even make the LCD screen have an extremely high frame rate. It's faked, and it could also do another trick. Frame buffers and comb filters would stick new frames between the 24 original ones to make them look better. And this had any frame rate that was needed based on how much motion. This is sometimes referred to in the same way on YouTube videos as the compressor routine, adapting to motion on the screen. When I do this, it's going to use a different rate of frame compression than if I'm just holding still, moving my mouth, and maybe blinking. Justin Bieber's eyeball rollout thing, the defects increase when you do that. But the neat thing about this happening inside of the screen is it could take an LCD screen that was crap, pre-process it for maybe a couple of frames first, and create extra frames and fake the image. On fast pans left to right or up to down, you would get less motion blur or no motion blur, and now you're back looking at the soap opera slash news flash effect. I'm going to call it that, not the soap opera effect, but the newsflash effect, because live broadcasts that interrupted things were fed from camera to transmitter directly to your screen, which means there was almost zero levels of generational noise induced. They were usually very crisp, the frame rate was high, it had virtually no motion blur because you were looking at a person talking to you like this. And if you did watch a video, they would pre-process it to clean it up because you were looking at broadcast standard video, because you were watching a direct broadcast, not recorded on VHS or beta, which is actually better. You would be watching a direct transmission. Direct transmissions are hyper-realistic compared to normal broadcasts. So the same visual cues, subconscious ones as they may be, for the hyper-real memories most of us share are also shared with soap operas and cheap production values. And direct-to-video recordings that you would get for your kids sometimes looked hyper-realistic. And some animations which are completely falsified. And many animations for movies, and especially deep fakes recently, that don't include any motion blur. There are endless tutorials on adding motion blur to make things look more real, even though the motion blur is a parasitic effect of the artificialness of what you're watching. This topsy-turvy universe, a lot of you, including me, perceive what we see through media, mass media, and also our micromedia we use here, is based on that subconscious perception that something is or isn't real, and we just don't know why, simply because we may be using better or worse quality methods at recording. I don't edit, not because I'm trying to be real or look realistic, but because I don't like editing. Lens flares are considered more real than reality, so they're added into movies. Too much. Originally, this was a way of showing someone was just using the camera and filming directly without any editing. Of course, they were editing, and it was a cheap trick. People would add coatings to these lenses to make sure that they didn't get lens flare, so that you would see every bit of it and not have to deal with the camera. Because at one time, the camera would be considered something that would get in the way of you perceiving yourself as being in the situation. High refresh rate LCDs that run at 120 to 240 frames per second also can eliminate, or almost totally eliminate, the motion blur by just computing the images and cleaning them up. Way too much. That's because the 240 frames a second and 120 frames per second are multiples, effectively, of 24 and 30 frames a second. They don't even have to do any interpolation. They just put it up, and then in between, they do something called tweening or in-betweening, which is an animation technique, going back to it, where the software and hardware simply fake the frames. This is also the method used for compressing video in the first place, by taking my hand and this background of my face, and if I stop talking, it will animate just my hand. The rest of the image becomes irrelevant. That's why Justin Bieber blinking in that video, his eyes appear to disappear. It's because the program for doing the compression screwed up. You can do it on purpose. I'll include a playlist if you want. you'll look at them, you'll watch them. Some of them are terrifying, and they look like a bad trip. Remember, when you have a nightmare or a dream, it's always realistic looking because your eyes don't have a frame rate. They continuously take in information and refresh. Although you can have motion blur happen in reality, which is one of the reasons we overlook it. This ultra-smooth motion estimation, compensation, interpolation, ME/MC soap opera effect makes everything on your TV look like a cheap direct-to-video recording and also look like the effectively very expensive direct transmission from a news event. At 30 to 60 frames a second, the soap operas or live broadcasts of hyper-realistic, very important news events, our hyper-real memories, share the same subconscious cues as our perception of fiction. Thank you for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.